What happens when a group of men mistake a woman's calm presence for weakness and think they can push her around? In the heart of the city, Samantha Rhodes, a former Navy SEAL, shows them just how wrong they are. With years of training and a sharp mind, she turns the tables, proving that no one, no matter their size or arrogance, can intimidate her. Watch as the tables turn and the streets become the battleground for a fight for respect. Samantha Rhodes adjusted the strap of her gym bag as she walked down the bustling city street, the sound of her sneakers tapping against the pavement almost rhythmic. The sun hung high, casting a golden glow over the city, but Samantha barely noticed it. Her mind was elsewhere, focused on the intensity of the workout she had just finished at the gym. She was used to the physical strain. Her years as a Navy SEAL had ingrained discipline into her body and mind, sharpening her awareness in a world that often seemed unaware of its surroundings. Now, after her service, Samantha found herself adjusting to civilian life, a life where threats weren't always as clear-cut, but still presented themselves in unexpected ways. She walked with purpose, her back straight, her eyes scanning the crowd around her. She was confident, comfortable in her own skin. Even in a busy urban area, where strangers moved past her in all directions, she never lost focus. She had learned to react only when necessary, to remain calm even when the world was chaotic. Across the street, a group of men leaned against a graffitied wall, laughing loudly. They were an unmissable presence, standing out in the crowd with their raucous voices and crude jokes. The leader, a tall man with a cocky grin, caught sight of Samantha as she passed. His eyes lingered on her, a smirk forming on his face. "Hey, check her out!" Greg Daniels, the leader, called out, elbowing his friend Alex, who snickered and leaned closer. "Yeah," Alex replied, his voice dripping with mock admiration. "She's got that look like she's too good for the rest of us." Ryan, the third member of the group, hesitated for a moment before joining in, his voice a little quieter, but still laced with judgment. "Bet she's one of those rich, stuck-up types. Thinks she's untouchable." Samantha didn't even break her stride. She was used to this kind of attention, men thinking they could degrade or intimidate her simply because of her appearance. Their words were like background noise, fading into the hum of the city. Greg wasn't done. He pushed himself off the wall, stepping forward, blocking her path. "What's the matter, sweetheart? Too good to even look at us?" Samantha's sharp eyes flicked briefly to the side, noticing the change in his stance. His words weren't new, but she knew the situation was about to escalate. She kept walking, unbothered, her pace steady, her mind already calculating the potential threat. "Come on, honey," Greg continued, his voice louder now. "We're just trying to be friendly." He stepped in front of her, forcing her to stop. She halted but kept her body language calm, never showing any signs of alarm. Greg's actions weren't a surprise. He was the kind of man who thought a woman like Samantha, walking alone, was an easy target. But that assumption would prove to be his biggest mistake. "Don't ignore us," Alex chimed in, moving a step closer. "You think you're too good for us, huh?" Samantha's gaze never faltered. She wasn't going to engage with them. She had learned long ago to ignore these kinds of men, to keep her head down and move forward. But the tension in the air was palpable now. She could feel their aggression building. "Is that how it's going to be?" Greg taunted. "Not even a thank you for all the attention we're giving you?" Samantha's voice was steady, but cold. "I didn't ask for it." Greg's eyes narrowed. He hadn't expected her to respond at all, let alone so bluntly. "Well, maybe it's time you learned a lesson in manners, sweetheart," he sneered, stepping forward. Ryan, standing a little off to the side, muttered under his breath. "She thinks she's too good for this. We'll teach her." Samantha's body was perfectly still, her posture unshaken, but her mind was already working through her options. She could already tell how this would play out. They were too confident, too sure of themselves to realize they were about to walk into a trap of their own making. She was a Navy SEAL for a reason, calm, calculated, and always aware. "Move," she said, her voice quiet but firm. She wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of a bigger confrontation. Greg, now emboldened by her refusal to back down, stepped closer. "What's the matter? Don't you like attention? Maybe we should give you something to remember us by." Samantha's eyes hardened, narrowing in on him as she took in his movements. She could tell he was getting ready to escalate this, and she was prepared. "I told you to move," she said again, her tone not changing. Greg smiled, thinking he had the upper hand. But Samantha wasn't intimidated. As Greg lunged toward her, trying to grab her gym bag, she reacted instantly, her hand swiping his outstretched arm away with a swift, practiced motion. He stumbled back, surprise written all over his face. "What the hell?" Greg barked, his anger rising. His hand stung from the quick slap, but it wasn't just pain that had him stunned. It was the realization that she wasn't the helpless woman he thought she was. She was dangerous, and that thought unsettled him. Samantha didn't wait for him to recover. She was already on the move, sidestepping past him, calculating her next move. She knew that if they made the first move, they would quickly learn they had underestimated her, and this wasn't going to be a situation where they would get away with it. Alex and Ryan hesitated for a second, exchanging uncertain glances. But then, Greg's voice rang out again. "You want to do this the hard way, huh?" Before they could react, Samantha's calm demeanor cracked with a precision-driven movement. She turned swiftly, her legs sweeping Greg's feet out from under him. He stumbled backward, hitting the pavement with a loud thud. Alex and Ryan, momentarily stunned, looked on in disbelief. "You're making a mistake," Samantha said coldly, her voice carrying a warning. They had pushed her to a point where there would be no turning back, and they had no idea what they were about to face. Greg Daniels, still sprawled on the pavement, cursed under his breath as he tried to push himself back up. His face was contorted in pain and frustration. He had just underestimated a woman he thought would be an easy target, and now, as his friends hesitated, it was becoming clear that this encounter was no longer going the way he expected. "Get up, man!" Alex shouted, his voice laced with panic. He extended a hand toward Greg, helping him to his feet. "Shut up!" Greg growled, brushing off the help. His pride was wounded, and his anger was only growing. "You don't get it. She's not like the others. She's playing games." Ryan, the youngest of the three, stepped back nervously. He was no fighter, just a guy caught up in the wrong situation. He had thought this would be another random encounter, one where they could get some laughs, maybe intimidate someone. But this woman, Samantha, was different. She wasn't afraid, and now that she had knocked Greg off his feet, Ryan wasn't so sure about the plan anymore. "I don't think we should mess with her," Ryan said quietly, his voice wavering. "Are you serious?" Greg snapped, spinning around to face Ryan. "You think she's tough? She's just a woman." He glanced at Alex, who was looking uncertain. "You two are pathetic. You think this is over?" Samantha stood a few feet away, her eyes scanning the situation. She had given them a warning. She had shown them what would happen if they tried to escalate things. But it seemed they didn't get the message, and she wasn't about to back down now. She didn't need to fight them all at once. She didn't need to be aggressive. She just needed to make them realize they had made a mistake. But as Greg and Alex took a step toward her again, she knew it wasn't going to stop there. They weren't backing off. Greg and Alex were still too cocky. Ryan was unsure, but that didn't matter. The real problem was Greg. He was trying to hold on to his fragile sense of control. It was time to show him just how out of his depth he was. "You really think you can intimidate me?" Greg asked, his voice low and threatening. "You've got no idea who you're messing with." Samantha's expression didn't change. She could hear the familiar tones of overconfidence in his voice, the same arrogance she had dealt with countless times before. The kind of man who assumed because of his size and bravado that he could impose his will on others, especially women. But she wasn't just any woman. "I don't want to fight you," Samantha said calmly, her voice a stark contrast to Greg's rising anger. "But I will defend myself." Greg's eyes narrowed. "You think I care about your warnings?" He stepped forward, closing the gap between them. "You won't walk away from this." Before she could react, Greg lunged at her, his hands reaching out for her shoulders, trying to grab her and push her off balance. Samantha didn't flinch. She moved with fluid precision, sidestepping his charge and grabbing his wrist as he passed. In one swift motion, she twisted it, forcing him off balance. Greg grunted in pain as his body was spun around and he was sent stumbling. But he didn't fall. Instead, he quickly regained his footing, turning with a scowl and readying himself for another attack. Alex, still hesitant, lingered at the edge of the confrontation, unsure of whether to get involved. He had seen Greg struggle. but the thought of taking on a woman who had just taken down their leader made him hesitate. But Greg, never one to back down, urged him on. "Come on, Alex! Get her!" Greg shouted, his voice laced with frustration. Alex, though unwilling, had no choice but to comply. He lunged toward Samantha, trying to land a punch to her side. But Samantha was faster. She dodged his attack, her body fluid and agile. As he swung again, she ducked, her knee connecting with his ribs. The force of the blow sent him crashing to the ground, gasping for breath. Ryan watched in horror as his friend struggled. His fear was becoming palpable. He had never been a fighter, and now seeing both Greg and Alex on the ground, his instincts kicked in. He was afraid. The fear wasn't just for himself, it was for all of them. Samantha took a step back, scanning the situation. The two men who had tried to overpower her were now on the ground, clutching their sides and gasping for air. Greg, who had regained his stance, looked at her with pure rage. He had underestimated her, and now the consequences were clear. "Are you done?" Samantha asked, her voice calm but cutting. "Because I don't have time for this." Greg's face turned red with anger. He wiped the sweat from his brow and looked toward Ryan. His expression was that of a man who knew he had no choice but to finish what he had started. He was not backing down, not now. "Get up, Ryan!" Greg shouted, his voice rough. "We're not done. You think she's gonna scare us? She's nothing." Ryan hesitated, but his legs felt weak. He knew deep down that they had miscalculated. They had pushed her too far, and now it was a losing battle. He wasn't sure he wanted to continue, but Greg was still the one in charge, and Ryan's nerves were too rattled to stand up to him. "Greg, I don't know about this," Ryan said, his voice filled with doubt. Greg's fury flared. "Shut up," he snapped. "You're going to fight or you're going to regret it." But just as Greg moved to charge once again, Samantha made her next move. With a simple step to the side, she avoided his punch, and then, before Greg could even react, she grabbed his arm, twisted it behind his back, and pushed him forward. He crashed into the side of a nearby car, his face contorted in pain. Alex, still recovering on the ground, scrambled to his feet and tried to get involved, but his movements were sluggish. Samantha turned her focus on him for just a moment, and with one swift strike, she kicked him in the knee, sending him back to the pavement. "Stay down," Samantha ordered, her voice cold. Greg, still dazed from the collision, stumbled to his feet again, rage consuming him. "You think this is it? You've got no idea who you're dealing with." Samantha looked at him, her expression unwavering. "No, Greg, I know exactly who I'm dealing with." With that, she stepped forward, ready to put an end to the confrontation. She wasn't here for a fight, but she wasn't going to walk away and let them think they could get away with their threats. Greg Daniels was furious. His pride had taken a massive blow, and now his body was bruised and aching from the swift takedown Samantha had executed. He hadn't expected a woman to fight back like this. Not like this. Every move she made was controlled, deliberate, and efficient. He could barely keep up. He stumbled back to his feet, glaring at Samantha as though she were the source of all his frustration. "You think you've won?" Greg spat, wiping the blood from his lip. "You haven't seen anything yet." Samantha stood still, her arms by her sides, her stance grounded and firm. She hadn't broken a sweat yet, and that only seemed to enrage Greg more. He wasn't used to being made to look so weak, and it was gnawing at him. Greg's eyes flicked over to Alex, who was still lying on the ground, groaning in pain. Ryan, standing off to the side, looked absolutely terrified. Greg's fury surged again. He didn't care about the others. He cared about one thing: his control. This woman had taken it from him, and he was determined to get it back. "Get up, Alex!" Greg shouted, his voice filled with frustration. "We're not finished." Alex groggily pushed himself to his feet, his knees shaking. The thought of another round with Samantha didn't sit well with him, but he stood nonetheless, not wanting to be seen as weak in front of Greg. Ryan, on the other hand, looked like he might faint. His gaze flickered between Greg and Samantha, then back to the ground. He didn't want any part of this anymore. "You're on your own, Greg," Ryan said shakily, his voice barely audible. I'm not fighting her again." Greg's eyes narrowed. "You're pathetic," he sneered. "You think she's going to let you off the hook? You think she's just going to walk away from this?" Ryan didn't answer. His body was still trembling, and his resolve had long since crumbled. Greg was the one who was supposed to lead, but even now he could feel his confidence slipping. He needed to make a move, something to prove he still had control. Greg finally turned his focus back on Samantha. His breathing was heavy, and he was growing desperate. He couldn't let her think she had gotten the best of him. His jaw clenched, and he took a step forward, ready to make his move. But this time, Samantha didn't back away. She stood her ground, waiting for him to come at her. "You want to keep playing?" Samantha's voice was low and calm. "Fine, but I warned you." Before Greg could react, he lunged at her again, this time with both hands reaching for her neck. The move was wild, desperate, and predictable. Samantha sidestepped him again, her movements swift and practiced. She grabbed his wrist mid-lunge and twisted, using his momentum to send him crashing into a nearby streetlight. The impact rattled Greg, and for the first time he looked stunned. He struggled to get up, his chest heaving with the effort. He wasn't used to this, used to being the one in charge, the one who made people crumble. But now he was the one crumbling, the one who was being shown just how little power he truly had. Samantha took a step back, her face unreadable, her posture unyielding. "This is over, Greg," she said softly. "It didn't have to go this far, but you wouldn't listen." Greg staggered to his feet, his eyes wide with fury and disbelief. He looked around quickly, his mind racing for another way out, but he found none. He was cornered, humiliated, and still trying to hold on to whatever sliver of control he could. "You don't scare me," he growled, stepping toward her again, his hands raised in anger. "You think you're something special, don't you? Just because you've got some skills, you think you can take down anyone." Samantha remained silent, her body poised, her eyes never leaving his. She didn't need to say anything more. Her calm demeanor spoke volumes. Greg swung at her, the force behind his punch making the air whoosh. But Samantha saw it coming. She ducked under the swing and delivered a precise elbow to his side. The force of the strike made Greg stumble, his breath catching in his throat. The pain was sharp and immediate. Greg swung again, this time with more desperation. He was trying to overpower her, trying to make up for all the ground he had lost. But his attempts were futile. Samantha sidestepped him, moving with the fluid grace of someone who had trained their entire life for moments like this. "You're not in control here," Samantha said quietly, "and you're about to learn that." Greg's face twisted with anger, but beneath the fury, there was a flicker of doubt. Doubt that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't going to walk away from this unscathed. His chest was heaving with exertion, and his movements were becoming sloppy, more erratic. His anger was clouding his judgment, and Samantha knew it. She stepped forward, placing a swift kick to his shin. Greg howled in pain, his body crumpling slightly from the force of the blow. But he was relentless. He surged forward again, trying to grab her by the shoulders, his hands closing in. Samantha didn't even blink. She moved in closer, using his weight against him, and with one quick twist, she sent him sprawling backward onto the concrete. Greg lay there for a moment, disoriented. His chest heaved as he tried to catch his breath, but he couldn't seem to regain his footing. His body was bruised, battered, and his pride was shattered. Samantha stood over him, her gaze cool and measured. "Stay down," she said firmly. "You don't get to hurt anyone else." Greg's eyes flashed with defiance, but his body betrayed him. He was done. Alex and Ryan remained silent, their eyes flicking between Samantha and Greg. It was clear now. Greg wasn't going to be able to take her down, and neither was Alex. Ryan, still unsure of what was happening, took a few steps back. He wasn't a part of this anymore, not physically anyway. Samantha took one last look at Greg, making sure he wasn't going to make another attempt to rise. Then she turned and walked toward the alleyway, her body still carrying the weight of the fight, but her steps confident. She hadn't just defended herself, she had shown them all something far more important. There were consequences for actions like theirs. Samantha's mind was already a step ahead as she walked away from the confrontation, her body still alert despite the calm exterior. She didn't expect Greg, Alex, or Ryan to be done just yet. People like them, men who thought they could dominate, intimidate, and harass, didn't learn easily. If they had any kind of self-awareness, they would have backed off by now. But the reality was they didn't. and that meant the fight wasn't over. As Samantha reached the corner of the street, she paused for a moment, her eyes scanning the surroundings. Her heartbeat was steady, and her breath had returned to a controlled rhythm. But there was no mistake. Her body was feeling the toll of the confrontation. Her ribs ached from where Greg had slammed into her earlier, and her shoulders stung where his wild swings had grazed her. But it wasn't pain that consumed her. It was resolve. She had come to expect moments like this. Moments when she would have to push herself, when there was no time for fatigue, no time to question whether it was worth it. The world didn't stop for weakness, and neither did she. The sound of hurried footsteps interrupted her thoughts, followed by the unmistakable sound of Greg's voice, furious and determined. "She thinks this is over, huh?" Greg's words were full of venom. "She's not walking away from this. Not yet." Samantha's sharp eyes turned to the street behind her. She hadn't been walking fast enough to leave them behind completely. Greg, Alex, and Ryan had regrouped. No surprise there. They were still chasing her down, their egos wounded but not crushed. And it seemed that Greg in particular had no intention of letting her go. Her senses heightened as she heard their footsteps quickening behind her, the sound of their breathing shallow with the adrenaline of the chase. Samantha turned her body slightly, subtly shifting her stance. She wasn't about to get caught off guard. She kept walking, her pace steady, but her senses alert. The city had become her battleground, but she was used to this. Years of training had honed her ability to react before a threat even materialized. She could hear their footsteps growing louder, getting closer, but she didn't flinch. She just kept moving forward. Greg's voice cut through the air again, full of anger and frustration. "You can't outrun us, sweetheart." His words were thick with mockery, but Samantha could hear the uncertainty beneath them. They weren't as sure of themselves anymore. That was the opening she needed. Without turning around, Samantha slowed her pace just enough to allow them to close the distance. She didn't need to run faster. She just needed to stay in control. The streets were still bustling with pedestrians, but there was an urgency to the situation now. She could feel the tension rising, the crackling energy that always preceded a confrontation, and she knew, deep down, that they weren't going to give up until they were either stopped or incapacitated. Greg surged forward again, pushing past a group of pedestrians in his path, his face twisted with anger. "Get out of the way!" he yelled at them, shoving his way through the crowd. Alex and Ryan followed closely behind, trying to keep up, but their movements were less coordinated, more frantic. They were starting to lose their confidence. Samantha's sharp eyes tracked their every movement. She didn't need to outrun them. She just needed to wait until the moment was right. She turned sharply down a side alley, forcing Greg, Alex, and Ryan into the narrow passage. The walls of the alley closed in on them, leaving them with little room to maneuver. They had made a crucial mistake. They had boxed themselves in, thinking they could outsmart her. Greg was the first to make the turn into the alley, his footsteps heavy and rushed. He was driven by pure rage now, and it clouded his judgment. Alex and Ryan followed, more cautiously, unsure of what was coming next. Samantha, however, had already mapped out her next move. She could feel the adrenaline surge in her veins, her body gearing up for the confrontation that was about to unfold. Ryan, who had been lagging behind, was the first to falter. His legs were trembling, his breath shallow. The chase had taken its toll on him, and his resolve was wavering. He wanted out. He had no stomach for this kind of fight. Samantha could see it in his face. "Greg," Ryan called out weakly. "Maybe we should—" "Shut up," Greg snarled, not even looking back. His focus was solely on Samantha now. "We don't stop until she knows who's in charge." Samantha's lips curved slightly as she watched them. She could almost see the panic beginning to set in. Greg was starting to realize that he was not the one in control. Not anymore. She had made that clear when she had effortlessly taken him down earlier. And now he was chasing her, desperate, his moves more reckless with each passing moment. She kept moving down the alley, her steps light and silent, aware of the fact that this would be the turning point. They were closing in, but they weren't ready for what she had planned. Suddenly, Greg charged at her from behind, his anger blinding him to everything else. He reached out, trying to grab her once again, but this time, Samantha was ready. As he lunged toward her, she sidestepped him, moving with fluid precision. His momentum carried him forward, And as he stumbled past her, she caught him by the shoulder, spinning him around. Before Greg could react, she twisted his arm behind his back, forcing him into the wall of the alley with a sharp thud. The force of the move left him winded, and for a brief moment, he faltered. Alex and Ryan, seeing their leader taken down again, stopped in their tracks. They were unsure of what to do now, their previous bravado replaced by hesitation. It was clear they were outmatched, and they knew it. Samantha stood tall, her eyes scanning the two men left. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't made a single unnecessary movement. Her training had taught her to control the situation, to let the fight come to her, not the other way around. And now, with Greg pinned against the wall, the fight was over. "Do you really want to keep this going?" she asked, her voice low but firm, her eyes locking onto Alex and Ryan. Neither of them answered. They stood frozen, their minds racing as they realized just how far they had gone in the wrong direction. "Get out of here," Samantha said, her voice cutting through the silence. "Now!" Greg, still struggling to catch his breath, glared at her. "You think this is over?" he growled, his voice barely audible. But there was no confidence left in his tone. He had lost. Samantha didn't give him a chance to recover. She shoved him back, pushing him further into the alley wall. A final warning. "Yes," she replied simply. "It is." With one last glance at the two men, she turned and began walking away, leaving them there, defeated and broken. They weren't worth her time anymore. Samantha didn't waste a second. As she turned her back to Greg, Alex, and Ryan, her mind was already working through the next step. She had given them a chance to walk away, offered them a moment to reconsider, but it was clear now. They wouldn't stop until they'd gotten exactly what they wanted, no matter how far they had to go. The alley grew quieter as she moved, but the adrenaline was still coursing through her veins. Samantha's body, still feeling the aftermath of the fight, urged her to slow down, but her instincts screamed for action. Greg, though beaten down, was not a man who would retreat. She could hear the sound of his hoarse breathing behind her, the shuffle of Alex's and Ryan's footsteps as they regained their bearings. "She's not getting away," Greg muttered to himself, still trying to catch his breath. He wasn't done with this. The bruises on his body were a reminder of his failure, but his ego refused to acknowledge defeat. Samantha could almost feel him behind her. His frustration would push him to make one last move, she knew. She'd learned that much about men like Greg. When their pride was wounded, they acted recklessly. They didn't give up, not until they had nothing left to lose. But Samantha wasn't like them. She didn't need to prove herself. She didn't need to chase victory. She simply needed to outlast them. Without turning around, she broke into a sprint, her gym bag bouncing against her side as she moved. She didn't look back, but her mind remained sharp, every step measured and calculated. The path ahead was filled with potential exits, places where she could lose them in the crowds or narrow alleys. But she had to be careful. They were cornered now, but desperation could make people unpredictable, and she wasn't about to take any chances. Behind her, Greg growled in frustration, the sound of his footsteps quickening. "She's running now. She won't get far." Alex and Ryan, still reeling from the earlier fight, struggled to keep pace. Their movements were slower, unsure. They had underestimated her, and now they were paying the price. But Greg wasn't about to let them fall behind. His voice rang out again, this time more urgent. "Keep up," he shouted as he pushed past pedestrians, weaving in and out of the crowd. "We can't lose her." Samantha's pace remained steady, her breathing controlled despite the adrenaline that surged through her. She knew this part of the city well, its streets, its alleyways, its hidden shortcuts. It was where she had trained herself to move quickly, where she had learned how to disappear in plain sight. But even with her advantage, she couldn't afford to get too comfortable. She darted into another alley, her eyes scanning the walls for anything that could help her outmaneuver the men behind her. She didn't know if they were following close behind, but she could hear their voices growing louder, their desperation pushing them further. "She's still ahead," Greg shouted, frustration lacing his voice. "She's not getting away this time." Samantha's heart rate increased slightly, but it wasn't fear, it was focus. She could hear their footsteps echoing through the narrow space. But the alley was too small for them to maneuver easily. This was her chance to outsmart them. At the end of the alley, a chain-link fence blocked her path. Samantha glanced at it, her mind racing. She could climb over it, but the sound of the men gaining on her made it clear that there was no time for hesitation. She needed another way out. Without breaking her stride, Samantha veered sharply to the right into a smaller alley. This one was even narrower, barely wide enough for her to slip through. The walls seemed to close in around her, but it was the perfect place to corner them. The alley ended at a dead end, exactly as she had planned. She stopped dead in her tracks, her back against a crumbling brick wall. There was nowhere to go now, but that was exactly the point. She wasn't running anymore. She could hear them coming closer, Greg's voice louder now, triumphant. "She's trapped! We got her!" But Samantha wasn't trapped. She was prepared. She turned slowly, scanning the alley's entrance. She didn't need to see them to know what was coming next. She had anticipated this moment when she turned down the alley in the first place. They would come at her with everything they had. "Don't think you're walking out of here," Greg yelled, his voice filled with arrogant certainty. "You'll regret this." Samantha's jaw tightened, her muscles coiling in anticipation. She had taken on Greg before. She knew his movements, knew how his anger would push him to act recklessly. She didn't need to make the first move. All she needed was to wait for him to make the mistake she knew was coming. A few moments later, Greg appeared, his eyes wild with anger. He stepped into the alley first, followed closely by Alex and Ryan, their faces twisted with confusion and frustration. They hadn't expected Samantha to turn back, but now that they had her cornered, there was no turning back for them either. Greg was the first to charge. He moved at her with the kind of reckless abandon that only comes when a person is desperate to prove they're still in control. Samantha's eyes locked onto him, her body poised, ready for what was about to happen. As Greg closed the distance between them, he threw a wild punch toward her. Samantha dodged easily, sidestepping his attack and stepping inside his reach. She grabbed his wrist, twisting it behind his back in one swift motion. Greg let out a strangled cry of pain, but she didn't stop. She shoved him forward into the brick wall, forcing him to crash against it with enough force to knock the wind out of him. He grunted in pain, his breath coming in shallow gasps. But there was no time to recover. As he struggled to turn around, Samantha was already moving. She shifted her weight and took a step back, her body coiling like a spring, ready for the next move. Alex, still standing off to the side, hesitated. He wasn't sure if he should step in or not, but his confusion made him vulnerable. Samantha didn't give him the chance to make up his mind. She moved quickly, delivering a precise elbow strike to his ribs, forcing him to stagger back, gasping for breath. Ryan, who had been standing in the back, looked on with fear in his eyes. It was clear now that he wasn't ready for this kind of confrontation. He took a hesitant step backward, but it was too late. Samantha was already closing the distance between them. Ryan's fear was palpable. He had been caught in the whirlwind of Greg's arrogance, Alex's brashness, and now all of it was crashing down on him. He wasn't a fighter, and he certainly wasn't prepared for someone like Samantha. Watching her handle Greg and Alex with such ease made his legs shake, and his mind raced for an escape. His instincts screamed at him to run, to leave, to find any way out of this mess. But where would he go? Greg was the leader of their little group, and he wasn't going to back down now. Even if they were outmatched, even if they had no chance, Greg's pride wouldn't let him admit defeat. Ryan's eyes flicked nervously between his two friends and Samantha. Greg was still gasping for air, his shoulder bruised from hitting the brick wall. Alex was recovering but still disoriented, clutching his ribs. And then there was Samantha, calm, collected, and ready for whatever they threw at her next. It was clear now, he wasn't going to be able to talk his way out of this. He wasn't strong enough to fight her. He wasn't capable of the kind of violence she was used to. All he wanted was to get out of the alley and disappear. But Greg wasn't going to let that happen. "You think we're done?" Greg hissed, pushing himself off the wall, wincing with every movement. "You think we're going to let you walk away like that?" Ryan flinched at the harshness in Greg's voice. "Greg, we should just leave," Ryan muttered, his voice barely audible. "We've made our point. We don't need to fight anymore." But Greg wasn't listening. He was consumed by his anger, his pride, his need to assert dominance. "She's not just walking away. Not after what she did." Greg took a step forward, his body rigid with fury. Samantha didn't flinch. She didn't back away. She just stood there, letting him come closer. She knew how this would go. Greg would charge, thinking he still had the upper hand. But the moment he attacked, he would make a mistake. And as expected, Greg lunged at her again, this time with a heavy, overzealous swing of his arm. He had no control anymore, his movements too wild, too filled with rage. Samantha sidestepped him easily, and as he overextended, she struck. A quick jab to his ribs sent him stumbling, and before he could recover, she drove her knee into his stomach. Greg doubled over, gasping for air, but he wasn't done yet. He glared at Samantha, hatred burning in his eyes. He tried to charge again, but his body was too worn out, his movements slow and uncoordinated. Samantha wasn't even breaking a sweat. Her training, her instincts, they were all in motion now. Each move deliberate, calculated. She wasn't angry. She wasn't scared. She wasn't anything except focused. "You're wasting your time," she said, her voice low and firm. "You had a choice. You could have walked away, but you chose this." Greg gritted his teeth, ignoring the pain and pushing himself to his feet. He wouldn't be humiliated by a woman, not like this. Not after everything. Behind him, Alex had finally regained his balance, though he was still hesitant. He was terrified, more so than ever. He didn't want to continue, didn't want to get involved in any more of this. But Greg was in charge, and Alex was stuck in the chaos Greg had created. Ryan, still standing at the edge of the alley, was looking for a way out. His body was shaking. He wasn't cut out for this. He wasn't cut out for any of it. But he had to follow. He had no choice. Greg was desperate, his mind clouded with anger and frustration. He wasn't thinking clearly anymore. He was making mistakes, and Samantha was just waiting for the next one. Samantha's sharp eyes caught the movement behind Greg. It was Alex. He was inching backward, his hands raised in an almost apologetic gesture, trying to avoid the confrontation. He didn't want to fight anymore. And Samantha, ever so observant, picked up on the shift in his body language. He was no longer a threat, at least not in the physical sense. "Alex," Samantha called out, her voice cutting through the air. "You don't have to do this." Alex froze, caught in the middle. His eyes flickered between Samantha and Greg, and for a moment it seemed like he was going to make a run for it. But Greg's voice stopped him. "You're with me, Alex," Greg snarled, his voice filled with venom. "We're in this together, remember." Alex took a step back, his face pale, torn between loyalty to Greg and the growing realization that things were getting out of hand. He didn't want to fight anymore, didn't want to be a part of this. But could he walk away? Could he leave Greg behind? "Greg," Alex started, but the words died on his lips. Greg spun around, his anger reaching a boiling point. "Don't you dare walk away from me," he shouted, taking a step toward Alex. "You're either with me or you're against me." Samantha saw the shift in Alex's expression, the uncertainty, the fear, the hesitation. She didn't want to fight him. She didn't have to. He wasn't the one who needed to be stopped. It was Greg. "Alex," Samantha said again, her voice softer now. "You don't have to be with him. You don't have to follow him." For a moment, Alex's gaze flickered to the ground, then back to Samantha. There was a flicker of something, regret, fear, maybe even understanding. But before he could say anything, Greg's voice thundered in the alley. "Enough of this!" Greg bellowed, stepping forward with fury in his eyes. "You'll regret this, Samantha." Samantha didn't wait. She moved in an instant, her body fluid, like water flowing around obstacles. She darted forward, sidestepping Greg's attack once again and using his momentum against him. She twisted his arm behind his back, forcing him into the wall once more. He grunted, his body faltering, but still he struggled. Alex watched in stunned silence as Greg was easily subdued once again. The fight was over. It had been over since Samantha took control. She had given them every opportunity to back down, to retreat, but they hadn't listened. And now there were consequences. "You had your chance," Samantha said, her voice firm as she released Greg, allowing him to slump to the ground. "But now you're done." Alex stood silently, his gaze dropping to the ground. He wasn't a part of this anymore. Not really. And Ryan, still off to the side, looked like he wanted to disappear into the cracks in the pavement. But Greg wasn't done. He looked up from the ground, his face twisted in pain and humiliation. But there was something else there too. Fear. Samantha wasn't about to let him go. Not after everything. "Stay down," she said simply. Greg didn't reply. He was too broken. The fight had been taken out of him. Samantha didn't look back as Greg slumped against the wall, his chest heaving with frustration and defeat. She knew this moment wasn't about victory. It was about making sure these men realized the weight of their actions, the consequences for what they had tried to do. The crowd that had gathered around them started to disperse, murmurs of disbelief and confusion drifting through the air. But she didn't have time to worry about the bystanders. She had one task left. With Greg and Alex incapacitated, it was time to deal with Ryan. Ryan's fear was almost palpable, his wide eyes flicking from Samantha to the men on the ground. He hadn't expected any of this. In his mind, he had just been looking for something to pass the time, a quick thrill or some sort of power over someone. But now he realized just how much he had overestimated his own ability to handle the situation. Samantha could see his hesitation from the corner of her eye. He was edging toward the alley's exit, his movements quick and erratic, like a cornered animal. It wasn't a surprise. He was scared, and it was clear that he wanted out of this situation more than anything. "Ryan!" Samantha called out, her voice calm but filled with authority. "It's over." Ryan froze in place, his body stiffening, and for a moment he looked like he might bolt. But then, as if reality was slowly sinking in, he hesitated. His breathing was shallow, his arms raised slightly, as if to defend himself. But Samantha could tell. He wasn't a fighter. He didn't even know how to hold himself in this kind of situation. "Please, I don't want any trouble," Ryan muttered, his voice shaking. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. It wasn't supposed to go like this." Samantha's gaze softened slightly, but she didn't let down her guard. "You made your choice when you followed them," she said quietly. "When you chose to chase after me. When you chose to stand with them." Ryan's eyes darted between Greg and Alex, both of whom were still struggling to recover, and then back to Samantha. His legs wobbled slightly as he took a hesitant step back, his voice desperate. "I wasn't trying to hurt anyone. I swear. I just didn't want to look like a coward." His words stumbled over each other, his panic rising. "They were pushing me and I—" Samantha cut him off. "You didn't have to follow them," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "You had a choice. You could have stopped. You could have walked away, and now you'll have to live with it." Ryan took another step backward, his legs unsteady as he tried to find a way out. But Samantha wasn't about to let him get away so easily. He had made his choices, and now he would face the consequences. "You don't understand," Ryan said quickly, his voice cracking. "Greg, Alex, they made me do it. I didn't want to be part of this. I didn't want to hurt you." Samantha took a step forward, her presence commanding. "You could have walked away, Ryan. They didn't make you do anything. You chose this, just like they did." Ryan opened his mouth to protest, but the words didn't come. Instead, he looked at Samantha, his face a mix of fear, guilt, and regret. It was the look of a man who knew he had crossed a line, and now there was no going back. "Please, don't!" His voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't want to be arrested. I don't want to be in jail. I didn't hurt anyone." Samantha shook her head slowly. "You may not have physically hurt anyone, but you were part of the threat. You were part of their attack, part of their harassment. That's enough." He fell silent, his hands trembling, his body shaking as if the weight of what had just happened was finally sinking in. But Samantha wasn't done yet. She had to ensure that Greg, Alex, and Ryan were held accountable for what they had done. They had no place in her world anymore. "I'm not going to hurt you," she said calmly, "but I'm not going to let you walk away from this. You'll face the consequences. You'll answer for your actions." Ryan swallowed hard, his breath ragged. I didn't think it would go this far." Samantha regarded him with a cool, steady gaze. "That's the problem, Ryan. You didn't think, and now you'll have to deal with it." She reached for her phone, quickly dialing the police, but she didn't speak. She didn't need to. She had already taken care of the situation herself. All she needed now was for the authorities to take over. The sirens in the distance grew louder, their wail piercing the otherwise quiet alley. Ryan flinched at the sound, his eyes darting nervously toward the entrance of the alley, as if hoping somehow the police would never arrive. But they were coming, and there was no running from the consequences anymore. Samantha turned her back on him and walked over to Greg, who was still crumpled on the ground, trying to collect himself. She didn't need to say anything to him. He already knew what was coming. Greg had pushed too far, and now it was time to face the truth. The screech of the police cruiser's tires echoed through the alley as it pulled up to the entrance. Two officers stepped out, their eyes scanning the area, alert and prepared. They quickly assessed the situation. Three men, bruised and battered, one of them subdued by a woman who had clearly handled herself with precision. One of the officers, a tall man with a graying mustache, approached Samantha. His expression was serious, but there was a hint of respect in his eyes. "You called this in?" he asked, his voice calm but professional. "Yes," Samantha replied evenly. "I have one of them detained. The other two are incapacitated. They were involved in an attempted assault and harassment." The officer nodded and gestured to his partner, who was already approaching Greg, who had attempted to rise but was still struggling to stay on his feet. "We'll take it from here," the officer said. Samantha stepped back, giving them room to work. Her mission was complete. She had stopped them, prevented them from hurting anyone else, and now it was in the hands of the police. She glanced at Ryan one last time. He was still standing there, his head bowed in shame, his body stiff with tension. He hadn't fully realized it yet, but this moment would define the rest of his life. Whether or not he chose to change was up to him now. The officers moved swiftly, quickly securing Greg and Alex. Samantha watched as they cuffed them and took charge of the scene. Her body still hummed with the energy of the fight, the adrenaline fading, but a cold satisfaction settling in her chest. It was over. They were done. She didn't need to say anything more to the officers. They already knew what had happened. She'd done their job for them, neutralizing the threat with nothing but her skills, her discipline, and her resolve. There was no question of her actions being excessive. She had been forced into a corner, and she had defended herself. No more, no less. Greg was muttering something under his breath, his face twisted in anger, but he couldn't escape the reality of his situation. He had tried to bully his way through life, to dominate those around him with threats and violence. But now, for the first time in his life, he was the one being held accountable. It wasn't something he could argue his way out of. "You're going to regret this, you hear me?" Greg spat as one of the officers shoved him into the back of the cruiser. Samantha didn't flinch. She simply watched as the door slammed shut, her expression unchanging. "No," she replied quietly but firmly. "You're the one who's going to regret it." The other officer, a younger woman with a calm demeanor, was already talking to Alex, reading him his rights. He looked shaken, his eyes shifting nervously between Samantha and the officer, as if unsure whether he should still stand by Greg or admit his involvement in the attack. His confidence had been shattered, and now there was no bravado left. Ryan, who had been standing quietly off to the side, now looked even smaller, as if the weight of the situation was finally crushing him. His shoulders were slumped, his hands clenched at his sides, his gaze fixed on the ground. He hadn't said much since the fight had ended, his mind still trying to process everything that had happened. Samantha knew he was scared, but fear, unlike anger, was something she could work with. It was a weakness she could exploit, a crack in the armor that made him far less dangerous than the other two. She walked over to him, her movements calm and deliberate, and placed a hand on his shoulder. He flinched at the touch, his body rigid, but he didn't pull away. "Ryan," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "this is your chance to change. You don't have to keep following them, letting them drag you into this mess. You don't have to be part of their chaos." Ryan didn't look up. He couldn't meet her gaze. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone," he mumbled. I just didn't know what to do. They pushed me. I thought maybe I could just get through it, you know?" Samantha squeezed his shoulder, a reminder that she was there, that she was offering him a way out. "You don't have to be afraid anymore. You can stop letting them control you." He still didn't say anything, but she could feel the weight of his decision in the silence. It wasn't just about the consequences he was facing now. It was about his future, whether he would continue to allow men like Greg to lead him down this destructive path, or if he would take responsibility for his actions and change. The officer who had been talking to Alex now turned her attention to Samantha. "We've got everything we need here," she said. "You've been a huge help." Samantha nodded, her gaze flicking back to Ryan one last time before she turned to leave. "You're welcome. Make sure you do your part," she added, her voice just loud enough for the officer to hear. The officer paused for a moment, then nodded. "We will," she replied. "You don't have to worry about them anymore." Samantha didn't respond. She didn't need to. She knew the system would take it from here. The three men would face justice, even if it wasn't immediate, even if it wasn't perfect. She had done what was necessary, what was right, and now it was out of her hands. As she walked away from the scene, the streets of the city felt different. There was still chaos around her. Horns honking, people shouting, the hum of the city life. But it didn't bother her. She had seen what could happen when someone decided to stand up, when they decided to fight for what was right, no matter the cost. It wasn't about the battle. It wasn't even about the outcome. It was about what she had learned through it all, the strength to push back when it mattered, and the wisdom to know when to let go. As Samantha continued walking, her thoughts turned inward. Her days as a Navy SEAL felt like a lifetime ago, but they had prepared her for moments like this. They had taught her how to read a situation, how to stay calm under pressure, and most importantly, how to fight, not just physically, but morally too. She would never be the kind of person who turned a blind eye to injustice. Not now, not ever. A few blocks away, she paused at a park bench, her legs finally giving way to exhaustion. The fight, the chase, the tension, it was all over now. But the weight of the night lingered. Her body ached from the physical toll, but her mind was sharp, clear. There was still work to be done. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she pulled it out, her expression unreadable as she glanced at the screen. It was a text from her former commander. "Heard what happened. Good work. Just remember, don't carry the weight of the world on your own." She let out a deep breath, the tension in her shoulders slowly ebbing away. For once, she felt a quiet sense of pride in the work she had done. She wasn't a hero, but she wasn't a victim either. She was someone who had stood her ground, and that made all the difference. Samantha sat there on the park bench, the weight of the night's events still pressing on her mind. The cool night air flowed around her, offering a small relief from the tension in her muscles. The city seemed quieter now, but the faint hum of the streets, the cars passing by, and the chatter of pedestrians in the distance reminded her that life was moving on, even though she was caught in a brief moment of calm. Her thoughts drifted back to what had transpired over the last few hours. She had stepped into the fray, an unwilling participant in an escalating game of dominance, and come out victorious. But it hadn't been about winning or losing. It had been about standing up for herself, drawing a line, and sending a message that no one, no matter how big or small, had the right to threaten her. Samantha closed her eyes for a moment and leaned back, feeling the slight pain in her ribs where Greg had struck her earlier. It was nothing serious, just a bruise, but the ache was a reminder of how physical this fight had become. The adrenaline that had once surged through her was finally beginning to fade, leaving her with the familiar exhaustion that always followed after a battle. Her body felt sore, tired, but there was a part of her that felt strangely lighter than she had in a long time. The years she had spent in the military, those long, grueling days of intense training, of dealing with life and death situations, had given her the skills to handle moments like this. She had been trained to survive, to stay calm under pressure, to make split-second decisions that could save her life and the lives of others. But it wasn't just the physical training that had shaped her. It was the lessons learned in the silence, in the moments between missions, when she could hear her own thoughts and learn who she truly was. Now, sitting on that bench in the calm of the city night, she felt something she hadn't felt in a while. Peace. It wasn't complete, she knew that, but it was the first step toward healing. The fact that she had stood up and fought back, that she had walked away with her integrity intact, gave her a sense of quiet pride. She was proud of the woman she had become. The phone buzzed in her pocket, snapping her from her thoughts. She pulled it out and saw a message from Laura, her best friend. "You good? Saw the news. Are you all right?" Samantha smiled, her fingers moving quickly to type a reply. Yeah, I'm fine. Just needed a minute. She didn't have to explain the weight of everything she had just been through. Laura knew her too well. The simplicity of the message was a small comfort. It felt good to know someone cared. For so long, Samantha had kept her struggles to herself. But after tonight, after everything she had endured, she realized she didn't have to carry the burden alone. Laura's message popped up immediately. Take your time. You've earned it. Samantha let out a quiet breath, letting the words sink in. She had earned it. She had earned the right to sit here and reflect, to feel the weight of the fight lifting off her shoulders. The battle was over, and though there was still a long road ahead, tonight at least she could rest. She stood up from the bench, her legs aching slightly from the tension in her muscles. She knew she couldn't stay here forever. There were still things to be done, calls to make, paperwork to fill out, and in the back of her mind, the growing realization that the events of tonight weren't just behind her. They had marked a turning point. Turning to walk down the path that led out of the park, Samantha took a deep breath. The city felt different now. The sounds, the streets, the people, they were all the same, but she wasn't. Samantha had learned a lot from the incident with Greg, Alex, and Ryan. It wasn't just about standing up to the men who had tried to harass her. It was about learning when to draw a line, when to speak up, and when to walk away. She had been tested in ways she hadn't been in years, and she had passed. But there was still more to consider. As much as the fight had been about protecting herself, it had also been a reminder of the wider issues that existed. Issues of power, control, and inequality that ran deep in society. There were always going to be people like Greg, people who thought they could push others around. But there would always be people like Samantha too, people who refused to be intimidated, who refused to let their voices be silenced. She couldn't change the world overnight, but she had made a difference tonight. Her phone buzzed again, and this time, it was a call. She glanced at the screen. It was from her old commander, Colonel Thomas. He had been more of a mentor than just a superior officer. They had stayed in touch after her discharge, and he had always been someone she could count on for advice, or simply to talk about the things that had happened during her service. She answered quickly. "Hey, Colonel." "Samantha." His voice came through the phone, gruff but warm. "I saw the news. Heard you had an eventful night." "Yeah, you could say that," she replied, her voice steady. "But it's over now." "I'm glad to hear that," he said. "You did good. I know it wasn't easy, but you handled yourself well." Samantha smiled slightly, though she knew he couldn't see it. "Thanks. It wasn't just me, though. It's been a long time since I've been in a situation like that. I'm still processing it." "Don't rush it," Colonel Thomas said. "Take your time. You did what needed to be done. I know how you work. But don't carry it all yourself, Sam. You've got people around you who care. Use that." Samantha felt the weight of his words settle in her chest. She had spent so many years pushing people away, thinking that carrying the burden alone was the only way to survive. But he was right. She didn't have to do it alone. Not anymore. "I hear you, Colonel," she said quietly. "I'll remember that." There was a pause on the line before he spoke again. "You've got this, Samantha. I know you do. But make sure you take care of yourself too. You deserve it." She replied, her voice soft. "I'll be fine. Just taking it one day at a time." After a few more words, they ended the call, and Samantha stood there for a moment, staring out at the city ahead. She had been through so much, physically, emotionally. But she wasn't broken. She was stronger than ever, and tonight had reminded her of that. The world would keep turning, she knew. There would be more battles ahead, but for now she could take a breath, regroup, and face whatever came next with strength and purpose. Because as much as it hurt to admit, she had learned the most valuable lesson of all. There were things worth fighting for, and she would never stop fighting for them. Her phone buzzed once more, pulling her from her thoughts. She looked at the screen again. It was a message from Laura. "Just checking in. Everything okay?" Samantha smiled, typing back quickly. "Yeah, I'm all right. Just need to rest. I'll talk to you tomorrow." She put her phone in her pocket and started walking again, her pace steady. The weight of the world hadn't crushed her, and it never would. She had faced her fears, fought back, and walked away victorious. But the journey wasn't over. It was only just beginning. And with that, Samantha kept moving forward.